On October 9, 1963, at exactly 10:39 p.m., engineers at the Vajont Dam in northern Italy watched in horror as an entire mountainside, 260 million cubic meters of rock and earth, slid into their reservoir in less than 45 seconds. The impact created a tsunami wave 820 feet high that overtopped the world's second tallest dam and obliterated 5 towns in just 7 minutes. 2,000 people died that night. But this wasn't a natural disaster. It was the deadliest engineering failure in human history. And the most terrifying part? The engineers knew it was going to happen. For 3 years, they had watched the mountain slowly creeping toward the reservoir. They had measured the cracks, monitored the movement, and calculated the inevitable collapse. Yet they did nothing to evacuate the towns below. This is the story of how human arrogance created a man-made tsunami that proved engineering hubris can be more deadly than any force of nature. The Vajont Dam was supposed to be a triumph of human engineering. Completed in 1959, it stood 858 feet tall, making it the second highest dam in the world at the time. Built into a narrow gorge in the Italian Alps, it was designed to harness the power of the Vajont River and provide electricity to the rapidly industrializing Veneto region. The dam itself was a masterpiece of concrete engineering. Its double-curved arch design could withstand earthquakes, floods, and the immense pressure of 150 million cubic meters of water. Italian engineers boasted that it was virtually indestructible, a monument to human mastery over nature. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. In their focus on building the perfect dam, they had ignored the mountain it was built against. Monte Toc, the 6,000-foot peak that formed the southern wall of the reservoir, was not the solid granite foundation the engineers had assumed. Geological surveys, limited and rushed due to political pressure to complete the project quickly, had missed a crucial detail. The entire southern slope of Monte Toc was an ancient landslide zone. The mountain was essentially a massive pile of limestone blocks, clay, and debris that had been slowly sliding toward the valley for thousands of years. The only thing holding it in place was friction and the absence of water. When the reservoir began filling in 1963, everything changed. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately after the reservoir began filling. In November 1963, just months after the dam became operational, engineers noticed something alarming. Monte Toc was moving. Eduardo Semenza, the chief geologist for the project, installed a network of monitoring instruments across the mountainside. What he discovered was terrifying. The entire southern slope, an area covering nearly 2 square miles, was sliding toward the reservoir at a rate of several inches per week. The movement wasn't random. It followed the ancient slide plane that geological surveys had missed. As water from the reservoir seeped into the mountain's fractured limestone, it was lubricating the clay layers that had held the slope stable for millennia. Semenza immediately recommended lowering the reservoir level to reduce pressure on the unstable slope, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. The dam's operators, SAID, Società Adriatica di Elettricità, had invested enormous sums in the project and were under political pressure to maximize power generation. Instead of heeding the warnings, SAID commissioned new studies that downplayed the risk. They hired engineers who assured them that while some sliding was occurring, it would stabilize once the mountain adjusted to the new water levels. By 1961, the movement had accelerated to nearly a foot per month. Cracks appeared in the mountainside, some wide enough for a person to fall into. Local residents in the town of Casso, perched on the slope above the reservoir, reported that their houses were shifting and cracking. Still, no evacuation was ordered. In a decision that would later be called criminally negligent, SAID engineers decided to conduct an experiment. They would deliberately raise and lower the reservoir level to see how the mountain responded, believing they could find a safe water level that would stop the sliding. The experiment began in 1962. As the water level rose, the mountain's movement accelerated. As it fell, the movement slowed but never stopped. Each cycle weakened the slope's stability further. like repeatedly bending a piece of metal until it snaps. Dr. Leopold Müller, an Austrian geologist brought in as a consultant, was horrified by what he observed. "They are playing with forces they do not understand," he wrote in a confidential report. "The mountain will eventually fail catastrophically, and when it does, the resulting wave could overtop the dam." His calculations showed that if the entire unstable mass slid into the reservoir at once, it would displace enough water to create a wave over 500 feet high. Even the mighty Vajont Dam, for all its engineering excellence, could not contain such a force. SAID executives dismissed Müller's warnings as overly pessimistic and based on worst-case scenarios that would never occur. They continued their deadly experiment, raising and lowering the water level while monitoring the mountain's response. What they failed to understand was that they weren't controlling the landslide, they were triggering it. By September 1963, the situation had become critical. The mountain was moving at nearly 8 inches per day, and the movement was accelerating. Massive cracks had opened across the slope, some over 6 feet wide and hundreds of feet long. Trees were tilting at impossible angles as the ground beneath them shifted. Local residents were terrified. Animals refused to graze on the unstable slopes. Dogs howled incessantly. Birds abandoned their nests and fled the area. Even the insects seemed to sense the impending disaster. On October 1st, the movement suddenly accelerated to over a foot per day. Semenza frantically recommended immediate evacuation of all communities below the dam, but SAID management refused. They argued that evacuation would cause unnecessary panic and damage the company's reputation. Instead, they made a decision that sealed the fate of 2,000 people. They began rapidly lowering the reservoir level, hoping to reduce pressure on the slope and slow the landslide. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. The rapid drawdown removed the water pressure that had been partially supporting the unstable mass. Like pulling a cork from a bottle, it removed the last restraint holding the mountain in place. On October 8th, the movement accelerated to over 3 feet per day. Rocks began falling into the reservoir with increasing frequency. The water turned muddy brown from debris washing off the unstable slope. At 10:30 p.m. on October 9th, seismographs detected a series of small earthquakes beneath Monte Toc. The mountain was beginning its final, catastrophic collapse. At 10:39 p.m. on October 9th, 1963, Monte Toc's southern slope finally gave way. In less than 45 seconds, 260 million cubic meters of rock, earth, and debris, equivalent to the volume of 100,000 Olympic swimming pools, slid into the Vajont Reservoir. The impact was beyond anything engineers had imagined. The landslide hit the water at over 60 miles per hour, instantly displacing half the reservoir's contents. The displaced water had nowhere to go but up. A massive wave, initially over 820 feet high, rose from the impact point and raced toward the dam at 45 miles per hour. To put this in perspective, the wave was taller than any skyscraper that existed in 1963. It was higher than the Chrysler Building, higher than the Washington Monument, higher than anything humans had ever built. The wave struck the dam with the force of a liquid mountain. Incredibly, the dam itself held. The engineers had been right about one thing: their concrete arch was virtually indestructible. But they had never designed it to contain a wave 3 times taller than the dam itself. The water overtopped the dam by over 300 feet, creating a second tsunami that raced down the Piave Valley toward the sleeping towns below. The village of Longarone, home to 1,450 people, was the first to be hit. The wave, still over 200 feet high, struck the town at 10:43 p.m., just 4 minutes after the landslide. In seconds, every building was swept away. Of Longarone's 1,450 residents, only 118 survived. The wave continued its rampage through the valley. Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Faye were obliterated in sequence. Each town had less than a minute's warning, the sound of approaching destruction, before the water arrived. By 10:46 p.m., just 7 minutes after the landslide began, the tsunami had spent its fury. 5 towns had been erased from the map. 2,000 people were dead. An entire valley had been scoured clean by a wave created not by nature, but by human negligence. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, SAID and government officials attempted to portray the Vajont catastrophe as an act of God, an unforeseeable natural disaster that no one could have predicted or prevented. This narrative began to crumble almost immediately. Journalists discovered the monitoring reports showing 3 years of accelerating landslide movement. Geological surveys revealed that the instability of Monte Toc had been known since the 1920s. Most damning of all, they found internal SAID documents discussing the landslide risk and the potential for catastrophic failure. The trial that followed exposed the full extent of the negligence. Engineers had known the mountain was unstable. Geologists had warned of catastrophic failure. Local residents had reported obvious signs of impending collapse. Yet no evacuation had been ordered, no warning system established, no emergency plans prepared. The court found that SAID executives and government officials had prioritized profits and political considerations over public safety. They had gambled with thousands of lives and lost. But the legal consequences were minimal. Most of the responsible parties received light sentences or were acquitted on technicalities. SAID was eventually nationalized, but its executives faced no meaningful punishment for their role in Italy's worst industrial disaster. The survivors and families of victims received modest compensation, but no amount of money could restore the communities that had been erased or bring back the 2,000 people who died because engineers thought they could control forces beyond their understanding. The Vajont disaster revolutionized dam safety and geological engineering. It proved that even perfect engineering could be useless if it ignored the natural environment it was built in. The tragedy led to new international standards for geological surveys before major construction projects. Engineers learned that they couldn't simply build structures to withstand known forces. They had to understand and account for the complex interactions between human construction and natural systems. The disaster also highlighted the dangers of what engineers now call normalization of deviance, the gradual acceptance of increasingly dangerous conditions as normal. For 3 years, SAID engineers had watched the mountain slide toward their reservoir, each day's movement becoming the new baseline for acceptable risk. Modern dam projects now require extensive geological studies, continuous monitoring systems, and detailed emergency evacuation plans. The technology exists to detect unstable slopes and predict landslides with much greater accuracy than was possible in 1963. But the fundamental lesson of Vajont remains relevant. Nature doesn't negotiate with human schedules or economic pressures. When engineers ignore geological realities in favor of political or financial considerations, the results can be catastrophic. Today, the Vajont Dam still stands, a concrete monument to both engineering excellence and human hubris. The reservoir behind it remains empty, filled not with water, but with the debris from Monte Toc's collapse. The towns below have been rebuilt, but they are different now. Memorials mark where Longarone, Parago, and the other villages once stood. Survivors and their descendants live with the knowledge that their communities were destroyed not by an earthquake or hurricane, but by human decisions. The Vajont disaster serves as a permanent reminder that the deadliest tsunamis aren't always born from the sea. Sometimes they're created by human arrogance, by the belief that engineering can overcome any natural force, and by the dangerous assumption that we can control systems we don't fully understand. In our age of massive infrastructure projects and climate change, the lesson of Vajont becomes more relevant than ever. Respect for natural forces isn't just good science. It's a matter of life and death for thousands of people who trust engineers to keep them safe. The man-made tsunami that killed 2,000 people in 7 minutes wasn't just an engineering failure. It was a failure of human judgment that turned a triumph of construction into a monument to the deadly consequences of ignoring nature's warnings.